Welcome everybody to today's event. Geneva Center presents The Shift, Supporting Autistic People's Mental Health, Clinician and Client's Perspective. My name is Ivana and I'm a behavioral consultant at the Geneva Center, and I will be your host for today. We're very pleased to see so many people today. We have such a large audience, so thank you so much for joining us. So The Shift is an exciting free virtual series launched to engage the neurodiverse community, families, educators, healthcare, and public service professionals to deep dive into diverse topics, expanding their understanding and to challenge pre-existing beliefs. So apart from The Shift, you can also expand your knowledge through Sonderly online training and the biennial symposium with the Geneva Center. Today, we will be addressing the topic of supporting autistic people's mental health, discussing both clinician and client perspectives. And so I would like to introduce our speakers for today. We are very pleased to have Amy Tint, a clinician, scientist, and clinical psychologist at the Azrieli Adult Neurodevelopmental Centre at CAMH. Her research uses mixed methods to understand how to improve supports and services for and with people with neurodevelopmental conditions, with a particular focus on the mental health needs of autistic girls and women. Dr. Tint is joined today by Riley Goldsmith, a youth engagement specialist at the Margaret and Wallace McCain Centers for Child, Youth, and Family Mental Health at CAMH. As a disabled autistic adult who has a direct and extensive experience with the mental health system, Riley hopes to further research and understanding of the intersection of disabilities and mental health. Mirella B has been an advocate for over 2 decades with experience working in hospital and community-based organizations across Ontario and Quebec. And currently, Mirella sits on the Azrieli Adult Neurodevelopmental Centre's Self-Advocate Advisory, co-facilitates a monthly workshop for newly diagnosed autistic clients at CAMH, and regularly presents to medical professionals and students. So before we start, please note that today's session is recorded and will be available by next week on our website. But we encourage you to use the chat function and to ask questions through the comment section on your right. And also today's PowerPoint deck will be available to download. So without further ado, please welcome Amy Tint. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. So we can go ahead and share our slides, please. All right. So thank you so much for the opportunity to present today. Like Ivana said, I'm Amy Tint. I'm a clinical psychologist and clinician scientist at the Azrieli Adult Neurodevelopmental Centre. And I'm joined by my colleagues, Riley and Mirella, who are autistic self-advocates at the Azrieli Centre. Next slide, please. Okay. So we want to start today's session by acknowledging that we're joining you today on lands that have been occupied by First Nations for millennia, lands rich in civilizations. As an uninvited guest on this land, we have the pleasure of living, working, and playing on this territory, and we're thankful for the Mississauga people who have cared for and continue to care for these lands. We honor their long history and commitment to this territory and uphold and uplift the voice and values of their people. We respect and affirm their inherent treaty rights of all Indigenous peoples across this land and continue to honor the commitments to self-determination and sovereignty we have made to the Indigenous nations and peoples. All settlers have a responsibility to consider what it means to acknowledge the history and legacy of colonialism. So we invite us all to think and reflect on some of these questions. How does this land acknowledgement relate to the work you are doing in the place you live and play? What's the history of the territory you live in, and what's the impact of colonialism there? What's your relationship with the territory, and how did you come to be there? How can we develop relationships with peoples whose territory we are living on? Next slide, please. Okay. So before we begin, we want to take a minute to explain our language choices and intentions behind this presentation. So we recognize how we define, describe, and discuss autism has changed over the years. Some people within the autism community identify with person-first language. So this would be saying something like a person with autism. And others strongly prefer identity-first language. So this would be saying something like an autistic person. And likewise, when we're talking about people without autism, while it was once common to refer to us as typically developing, you'll notice that today we're using terms like non-autistic or allistic. And even amongst the three of us presenting today, we have different views and preferences within our own language use, which is representative of the diversity within the autistic community and its allies. We recognize our own privileges and speak on behalf of only our own experiences. And we keep in mind, as Dr. Stephen Shore, an autistic professor, said, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. So we approach this presentation from a neurodiversity perspective that acknowledges autism as a result of natural variations of the human brain. And you'll notice our use of the infinity symbol, which has come to represent the broad and varied experiences within the autistic community and its allies. Next slide, please. So why are we here and what are we talking about today? So we'd like to talk about some of the concerns that we experience, myself as a clinician and Riley and Mirella as autistic people, providing and receiving mental health care. And the idea that these concerns exist isn't new. As you'll see on your screen, there's a small but steadily growing amount of literature summarizing a really wide range of clinician, patient, systemic related barriers to care. But rather than simply review these studies today, which they themselves really nicely summarize these difficulties, we'd like to take the opportunity to personalize it a bit more, to share with you what we've experienced, and also take time to focus on what's worked for us. Next slide, please. So here's a bit of an overview of what we hope to cover today. So Mirella and Riley are going to start us off by going over some common barriers that autistic people face when accessing and receiving mental health supports, including misunderstandings of autism and autistic identities, masking and burnout, and late diagnosis. And then we'll shift to talking about some autism-informed adaptations to providing mental health support, including tips that can be used for identifying co-occurring mental health concerns, adaptations for therapy sessions, and some examples of some helpful free resources. And we recognize that this is a complex topic and we won't be able to cover everything or even really touch on some really important key issues. But we hope by sharing our own lived experiences in terms of what's worked for us and what hasn't, that you may be able to walk away with a new idea, a new strategy, a new resource, or maybe simply the recognition and comfort knowing that this is tough work for both autistic clients and mental health providers alike. Next slide. Okay, so to start us off, Mirella is going to give us a brief overview of how we traditionally conceptualize autism, and Riley will then chat with us about some difficulties with these traditional conceptualizations. Next slide.
Autism is a neurodevelopmental condition that impacts how people communicate and how they experience the world around them. In the DSM manual, autism is defined by two broad autistic characteristics: social communication and focused interests and behaviors, formerly known as restricted and repetitive behaviors. What do we mean by social communication? This is how we interact and express ourselves with others. Autistic people often have challenges interacting with neurotypical people. Social interactions can often be tiring and difficulties reading people, verbal and nonverbal cues such as facial expressions. This can lead to misunderstandings and loneliness. The other category is focused interests and behaviors, formerly restricted and repetitive behaviors and interests. This can include repetitive body movements, echolalia, and stimming behaviors. These behaviors can give an autistic people a sense of control, helping them cope with overwhelming external stimuli, and a way to calm down and communicate their moods like excitement. Next slide.
So let's talk a bit about some outdated terms and forms of communication. High functioning and low functioning are actually outdated terms that don't help autistic individuals. These labels have been thrust upon us as though they alone can describe or encapsulate one's abilities. Who decides how well one functions on a daily basis? These functioning labels are determined by an outside observer based on their idea of what daily functioning looks like. I, for example, am highly verbal with an above average IQ, and when I was diagnosed in 2017, I was told that I was high functioning. But I didn't feel high functioning, and I still don't. I'm not in school, I live in my parents' house, I don't have my own bank account. These are just some basic adult milestones that I don't participate in because of my actual difficulties functioning, not just what a doctor who met me for 2 hours believed. We don't benefit from these labels because function is a spectrum that is in flux every single day. High functioning is used to deny resources, and low functioning is used to deny agency. So if the spectrum doesn't look the way it does on the left side of your screen, what does it look like? If you look at the image to your right, you'll see a pie chart where each slice is a type of function with 6 arcs in each piece denoting an individual's proficiency in each. For example, the hypothetical person shown here seems extraordinarily well-rounded with perfect marks in each category. Unfortunately, for most people, life is not this simple. Even non-autistic folks can be put into this graph, but they'll probably have less varied results than we do. Autistic people will have more diverse scores generally, potentially scoring quite high in sensory, perception, and motor skills, but quite low in language or verbal processing, for example. This person might be nonverbal, but still incredibly talented in these other areas. As autistic adults, we feel misunderstood in a world that also misunderstands us. The autistic experience has on countless occasions been compared to visiting a foreign country where you don't understand the language and no one can understand you. That is why so many consider autism to be a social communication disorder. But communication is an incredibly complex idea that shapes our identities more than you know. Communication is more than just talking. There are many alternate forms of communication or communicative mediums that reach much farther than the spoken word. For example, written word, physical movement, or emotional intuition are all valid forms of communication. Communication exists to get needs met. It is natural and something that we know from birth. Babies cry when they need something. They don't know how to speak yet, so they scream and they cry because that is the language that they use to communicate since they don't speak the same language that their caregivers do. Adults are able to communicate in more ways. We have a higher autonomy and are able to think complexly. One example that I like is communicating through art. We can generally understand art as a language. It makes us feel or understand something in a language that we don't necessarily speak. So when we take a step back from our beliefs of what valid communication looks like, you may find that autistic people don't need to speak to communicate at all, as long as you're willing to listen. What unites the autistic community is our unique and beautiful ability to communicate at a level that non-autistic people sometimes cannot. Autism is often thought of as a developmental disability that can create communication challenges on a social level, but the reality is that we can be exceptionally good at communicating, just not necessarily in a way that society expects. Next slide.
Thanks, Riley. So now Mirella's going to talk a bit more about some barriers that come about when people don't necessarily meet the traditional conceptualizations of autism. Next slide.
Most of what we do know about autism comes from studying young white boys. That means autism goes unidentified in women, trans, Black, and Indigenous individuals. Luckily, medical professionals are learning more about autism can present differently from person to person, and an increasing number of autistics are now being diagnosed later in life. Next slide, please. Medical professionals are also learning more about masking and camouflaging. where autistics hide their authentic selves, especially women and non-binary people. Autistic people often present or perform social behaviors that are considered neurotypical to survive in a neurotypical world. Masking may be necessary at times, but however, it carries negative consequences like autistic burnout. What is autistic burnout? A state of intense physical, emotional fatigue marked by unintentional unmasking of autistic traits and the loss of abilities. It is often presented by extended sensory overload, prolonged exposure to stress, and a lifetime of often expended masking or camouflaging. Often mistaken for depressive episode, it can be mild to severe and may have occurred more than once in the past. Autistic traits are heightened. Self-soothing compensates through stimming and selective mutism. Masking and burnout can complicate the diagnostic process, but many late diagnosed autistic people are often diagnosed as a result of burnout. My diagnosis came at 27 years old as after an autistic burnout at university. I met all my developmental milestones as a child. I just wasn't clear when I spoke. I had vestibular issues, fear of being thrown up into the air, fear of dangling chandeliers, fear of falling due to my clumsiness, especially at recess where socks hid my bruises. And I didn't alternate my steps on staircases. Handwriting was an issue when my second grade teacher told me and my fellow bad pension mate, Samantha, that it belonged to a museum. Oh, thank you, I thought. It wasn't a compliment. Think hieroglyphics. I went to speech therapy various times for my TH sound, although it could have been beneficial to many in my elementary school, including teachers. Friendships were unequal, where I was taken advantage or bullied for standing out. And this continued in my teen years, and along with it, depression and suicidal thoughts. At university, I questioned myself about my grades and essay writing due to executive dysfunction. But the person at the learning department at McGill University asked me questions whether I could tie my shoelaces, alternate my steps on stairs, whether I could catch the ball as a kid. She then told me it was visual spatial perception issues, and most of the university professors had it, whatever it was. And it was going to cost me $700 for the diagnosis and not change anything. For my second degree at Concordia, my marks were excellent until I went to Latin American Film Festival, a field trip in Havana, and I felt ill. Compounded by applications to grad school, I ended up with an autistic burnout whilst in counseling, and the psychiatrist misdiagnosed me with a label given to young people in university, despite the expert refuted it. The suicidal ideation meant I need to be hospitalized, and at the hospital is when I first heard of Asperger syndrome. Asparagus? Then waiting for the multidisciplinary team, which concluded, indeed, it was autism. Back then it was Asperger. Then came the power struggle between the private psychologist who didn't believe it, as she gave me an article on Vogue and compared me to a male person she knew. Regular psychiatrists looking at the file were convinced of my first misdiagnosis. He sent me to another neuropsychologist for testing and later made another autism luminary at the Children's Hospital as an adult in a cheerful, child-friendly assessment room, making perfectly symmetrical rocket with the blocks they gave me. So, did I pass? I inquired, exasperated. There's no pass or fail, said the second expert. But do I have Asperger's? Would an earlier diagnosis save me grief? It would certainly have saved me from antipsychotic meds that made me gain a considerable amount of weight in my first year at university. Sometimes family members, just like doctors, were in denial about the diagnosis. Autistics may go through an identity crisis, grief, mourning of what could have been had they known earlier, had supports, or living with imposter syndrome and flat-out rejection that they can be autistic, having psychologists supporting them might been help, unlike mine, who was actively dissuading my psychiatrist. Hey, you're supposed to be on my team. I couldn't continue with her if she didn't accept me. It was a question of trust. Next slide, please.
Thanks for sharing your story, Mirella. So next, Riley is going to share some more concerns about late diagnosis. And next slide, please.
There are very few specialized mental health services for autistic people in Ontario, and perhaps even more upsetting than that, there are many general mental health practitioners who specifically turn away autistic patients. Seeing how common co-occurring mental health conditions are in autistic patients, which we'll talk a bit more about later, the lack of available services for autistic people is incredibly distressing. There's also a focus on autistic youth in the mental health community. And as an adult, it can be disheartening and invalidating when Google only shows results like, what to do about my unruly autistic child, when I'm trying to find help for my unruly autistic adult self. I understand that it can be more difficult for general mental health practitioners to treat autistic patients. Our communication styles can vary, our self-reporting might not be quite how they prefer it, and of course, the presence of autism creates variations in our health that practitioners have trouble accounting for. But it is painful to have your life and identity reduced to an exclusion criterion. Next slide. This is me. I'm so sorry. Autism spectrum disorder is a neurodevelopmental disorder marked by social deficits, communication complexities, and the presence of specific repetitive behaviors and interests. It is not, on its own, a mental health problem, mood, or behavioral disorder. It is not, on its own, an intellectual disability. Autistic people have the capability to be successful, intelligent, empathetic, incredible individuals, just like everybody else. Yes, in many areas, we start a lot further from the finishing line than our neurotypical peers, but there are areas where we excel far beyond them too. Our capacity for falling in love with the world far exceeds the norm. Our lifetimes are filled with routines and special interests, which have been unfairly categorized as derogatory symptoms instead of what they could be, which are gifts. My routines give me safety and stability. My special interests give me joy and passion. As a community, autistic people have reclaimed our own identity to focus on what autism is, far more than what autism isn't. When we medicalize ASD, taking for granted the high risk of co-occurring disorders, it's easy to forget that these comorbidities are common, but not definite. Our co-occurring mental and physical health conditions need to be treated as seriously as they would in an allistic patient. The autistic capacity to live and to love life is stifled when we are written off as a failure of humanity, unworthy of care that we all deserve. The disorder that we are born with cannot preclude us from having our mental health treated, especially when the number of autistic people who are struggling is so high. Next slide.
Okay, so we're going to shift gears a bit now and talk about how do we go about looking for co-occurring concerns, mental health concerns, when we're working with autistic people. Next slide, please. So as Riley and Mirella have mentioned, growing up in a society that's not understanding, accepting, or supportive can affect how autistic people see themselves, others, and their lives. And maybe related to this, the prevalence of co-occurring mental health conditions in autism is strikingly high. So it's estimated that nearly 70% of autistic people will experience at least one co-occurring psychiatric disorder, and nearly 40% of people will meet criteria for 2 or more psychiatric disorders. Next slide, please. And because we know that autistic people can experience positive mental health at the same time. Not everyone is always experiencing a mental health crisis. But it's important to keep in mind as clinicians that both mental wellness and mental health concerns can present differently in autistic people. And because behaviors can mean different things for autistic people, it's important for us to keep in mind that our usual clinical cutoffs on standardized assessment measures weren't really validated for use with autistic people. And when we rely on these strict cutoffs, we run the risk of A, diagnostic overshadowing, where we attribute mental health concerns to autism, or B, we run the risk of overpathologizing, where we overpathologize what may be typical behavior patterns for an autistic individual. And that's not to say that standardized tools don't have any place in mental health work with autistic people. Scores can definitely be used descriptively to complement other information, to track symptoms over time. Next slide, please. So what do we as clinicians need to look for when we're looking for co-occurring or assessing for co-occurring mental health concerns with autistic people? So in addition to some of the sort of usual suspects that we might be looking for when we're screening for mental health concerns with anyone, so these include things like maybe an increase in sadness, a change in mood, increase in irritability, and so on, it's also really important to look for differences in the individual's unique routine. So routines that may look different from our non-autistic clients. And when we're talking about changes from usual routines, we need to be looking for uncharacteristic responses or changes in behavior, and keeping in mind that autistic people's usual daily lives, their routines and behaviors, may already look different from what we as non-autistic clinicians have in our heads as kind of quote unquote typical. So for instance, we might not think to check in about focus interests, and sometimes people call these special interests or stimming behaviors. So this is a quote from the Autism Mental Health Literacy Guide, which is a resource we're going to be highlighting at the end of our presentation, which really kind of drives home this point of needing to look for changes from an individual's baseline. So the quote reads, "Many of my stims are pleasure, feel-good stims to mitigate tough situations or when I'm feeling overwhelmed by stimuli. One of my big signs of depression is that I don't do any of these things to help me self-regulate because I can't be bothered and it's too much effort or energy. The loss of stims is a huge sign that I'm depressed." Next slide, please. So we wanted to take a minute here and to highlight this great tool that was developed by autistic folks in the UK as part of an organization called Ambitious About Autism. So the entire toolkit is free to download on their website, and it was made as a tool for autistic youth to be able to explain their normal or their baseline, to help themselves identify when something may be off, as well as a tool to help them communicate what's going on for them to the important people in their life. So I know it might be a bit hard for you to see, but there's two examples from the pages of the toolkit here. The first is about family and friends. So asking how often the autistic person likes to spend time with others. For someone who really enjoys spending a lot of time with family and friends and does it often, it can be an important sign that something's maybe off if they're spending more time alone. And on the other hand, if an autistic person generally prefers to spend time alone, then it shouldn't be too concerning if they check off on a questionnaire that they rarely or never go out with friends and family. And the second page here talks about interests and hobbies. So just like before, if someone likes to spend their free time, let's say kind of researching their favorite sports teams on the computer, it could be helpful to question if they no longer enjoy that or they aren't spending time doing that anymore. On the other hand, if someone usually spends their time out of the house and all of a sudden is spending a lot of time alone on the computer, it could be a clue to check in about that. Next slide. So unfortunately, we don't have a rule book in terms of how we should work with autistic people. Kind of the closest that we can come to at this point, I think, is the idea that we need to stay curious. We need to be curious when we're working on with autistic people as non-autistic clinicians. Next slide. So we want to highlight another resource here, and we're going to switch gears a bit now to think about how can we adapt therapy to best meet the needs of our autistic clients. And it's important to keep in mind that changes to therapy may benefit autistic people, but hopefully they would also promote just kind of a general universal design for learning. And the resource we want to highlight, which was created by another group of autistic adults in the UK, and we'll have the link for it at the end of our presentation. And it outlines really helpful ways to consider adapting your clinical practice when working with autistic adults. And the main message that we're going to be borrowing from this guide is the importance of staying curious. So what do we mean by that? So one way we can interpret that is that I, as a non-autistic therapist, experience the world in a different way than my autistic clients. I likely have different sensory processing needs, communication styles, and in turn, I'm treated differently by society. And I need to keep these differences in mind when I'm providing care to autistic clients. And Mirella is going to talk a bit more now in terms of the double empathy problem and how it can inform mental health clinicians' work with autistic clients. Next slide.
There is greater awareness of the differences in how neurotypicals and autistic express empathy. Previously, communication deficits were blamed on the autistic person, and they were told to adapt to a neurotypical way of being. An autistic researcher, Damian Milton, coined the term double empathy problem to describe the communication breakdown that goes both ways. Autistic people may not be so great at interpreting nonverbal cues of neurotypical people, but there's a growing body of research to show neurotypical people aren't so great at communicating with autistic people either. By ceasing to see the autistic person with deficits or shortcomings, we can remove barriers of the double empathy problem that can present in therapy. What does this look like in clinical practice? It means just recognizing there is inherent unequal model in communication. Maybe you are leaning in because your client is saying something interesting. Leaning in could look threatening to the autistic person. A therapist's posture or expression could look bored, even rejecting that was previously said to the voiced by the autistic. Recognizing the possible miscommunication, you can try translating your own nonverbals, like I'm smiling, I'm nodding because I'm interested in what you have to say. Next slide. Autistic people process sensory information differently, and this can impact the way they interact with the environment. An autistic person can be under, hyposensitive, or oversensitive, hypersensitive in any of the senses, including sight, hearing, and balance. Understandably, the sensory environment can impact the autistic person's ability to engage in therapy. At the same time, many autistic people are used to their sensory needs being dismissed and may be unable to advocate for their needs. Be curious. Ask your autistic clients how the environment may be impacting them and work together to problem solve. This quote demonstrates the impact. I would feel comfortable enough to bring headphones to wear when noise outside the therapy room is distracting, and a blanket to cover myself, as this makes me feel safer. But I feel I need the therapist's permission to meet my sensory needs in the therapy room. As my therapist is unaware of my sensory needs, those needs go unmet, and increasingly my highly camouflaged anxiety and distress. Next slide, please. Making the implicit explicit. We need therapists to be clear and explicit. So many aspects of therapy are incredibly vague, and we don't deal with vague. For instance, sometimes autistic people ask a lot of questions. We maybe appear nosy, but they're trying to do small chat and bond like they were probably told in the past by parents who were correcting them, and probably by social skill classes. If you work with an autistic clientele, make sure your motivation and expectations are clear. It is incredibly stressful when autistic people are left guessing, as this quote demonstrates. The therapeutic relationship is nothing like any other interaction I have in the real world. This means that all the rules, all the templates I have, the scripts, they just don't apply. It may seem very obvious to some people how therapy and the interaction with a therapist works, but on some level, it's not obvious to me. Therefore, having a therapist to be very overt, literally explaining the broad rules and expectations of the situation, vocalizing their thoughts and feelings in a constructive way, is the only way that will enable me to exist in the space. Otherwise, I am preoccupied with worry that I will act in a way that is not appropriate in that context. Next slide.
Okay, so keeping in line with the idea of making abstract concepts as concrete as possible, it's often helpful in therapy if we use worksheets and visuals. So this can include things like thought records, responsibility pies, scaling activities. And it's also important to keep in mind processing speed differences in autism. It can be helpful to extend the total number of sessions or maybe reduce the session length. And this can allow more practice time and opportunity to generalize skills outside the therapy session. And shorter sessions are often helpful to allow for pauses in learning. So again, going back to the idea that autistic people are processing the world in a different way than myself, I need to keep in mind all the steps that it took for them to get to my therapy session. Maybe the sensory overwhelm they experienced in transportation. And also keeping in mind just sort of the general fatigue that many autistic people experience existing as autistic in a neurotypical world. And keeping all that in mind, it's possible that my standard 50-minute therapy session might just be too much. So therapy can be, in my experience, a lot more effective when it's delivered in shorter sessions. Another important point is to keep in mind the idea of engaging family or close friends when appropriate in therapy to help with translating different ideas or different concerns and helping your client supply skills learned in daily situations. So I think Riley has a story for us about engaging family members.
Yeah, I personally love to have my mom, who is also my primary caregiver, in my doctor's appointments with me. She is my adaptive tool. She exists as a scribe, helping me remember what I need to tell my doctors, as well as helping me remember what they've said once we've left the appointment. Caregivers should be treated the same way you might interact with an ASL interpreter. They are present to translate between the autistic patient and their practitioner. Despite their presence, practitioners should still talk or interact primarily with their patient. Autistic patients with interpreters are still fully conscious adult humans who can feel hurt and disrespected if a doctor clearly only wishes to communicate with another allistic person. On the other hand, I have also experienced ableism to the point where my accessibility tools, such as having my caregiver in my appointment, were ignored or barred completely. When I switched from a pediatrician to a family doctor, years before I was diagnosed, but I was still autistic then, I had difficulty communicating my health needs and would often fawn in fear or defer to my mother, who could better communicate the answers to their questions. She was an interpreter and a memory tool for questions like, when did this start? Rate your pain on a scale, or what's your family history? The nurse would often suggest that we had a dysfunctional, dependent relationship and that it was inappropriate for me to have a family member in the appointment with me. We were once accused by my doctor of Munchausen by proxy. This type of medical ableism, denying my need and use of accommodations, of mistreating me and my health in comparison to how they might an allistic patient, can be traumatic. My accommodations and disabilities shouldn't affect the level of care I get. Treatment should be adapted to the patient and not the other way around. Next slide.
Okay. So it's also important to be curious about behaviors that we as non-autistic therapists may be tempted to interpret as resistance or maybe therapy interfering behaviors. So it's important to keep in mind, is your autistic client having trouble arriving to your sessions on time or forgetting to do their homework in between sessions because of a lack of motivation? Or is it executive dysfunction that's getting in the way? It's also important to keep in mind that many autistic people often experience alexithymia. That is, they often have difficulty identifying or describing their emotions. So open-ended questions like, how are you feeling today, are often not helpful and can be quite stressful for autistic clients. Instead, we can try to be more concrete in asking, what do you notice in your body right now? Or as a starting point, maybe thinking about more behavioral-based observations. Can you tell me what you did today? This means that maybe we need to spend more time on psychoeducation about emotional awareness than we're maybe used to when working with non-autistic clients. And it can also be a call to be a bit more creative in our sessions. So in the past, when working with autistic clients, it's been helpful to think about and observe the role of stimming behaviors while listening to different genres of music together to help with emotion identification. And Mirella also has a story about alexithymia.
One example of alexithymia occurred at our therapy center in a mental health group therapy session where a person was talking about her violent domestic partner when she was abruptly interrupted by the art therapist. He told us to say how we feel when she speaks. The circle had people judging her as tiresome and other negative feedback. As my turn came up as the very last participant to speak, I didn't want to pummel her with more judgment as she's a victim of domestic abuse. I said, she doesn't want to know what she wants to do, leave him or stay. The art therapist, knowing nothing about autism, became vitriolic and screamed at me, feelings, how do you feel? No analyzing. I didn't know how I felt by this bizarre kick her while she's down experiment. I had a bad experience with her, but I wasn't going to judge her. This story was an example of what not to do. Had he known a little bit about autism or alexithymia, he wouldn't have berated me. My mother usually knows how I feel before I do, and when I'm especially when I'm in a depressive state.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Mirella. And it's unfortunate that you experienced that. And like you said, really highlights the need for autism-informed mental health practices. And earlier, Mirella had talked a bit about how masking can contribute to late diagnosis. It's also important to think about the role of masking in therapy. So we need to be thinking about how our client is presenting and maybe how their automated or automatic script responses can differ from their true emotions. So it can be hard and challenging for both the client and the therapist to identify the extent of masking in session. It can be helpful to have open conversations about masking and camouflaging and discuss what you're observing as a therapist in session and how that may differ from your client's true feelings. It can be helpful to strategize ways that your autistic client can feel comfortable unmasking in session. For instance, maybe that means skipping the small talk in the hallway or when you first sit down in the room, in your therapy room. For some autistic people, small talk lends itself to automatic masking mode. So here's an example of a SWAN measure that another therapist uses. So the quote reads, "We use a SWAN measure to rate my anxiety when in therapy sessions. In recognition that I often strongly camouflage my anxiety, like the vigorous, unseen paddling of an apparently serene swan. I often outwardly appear very calm when inwardly I am experiencing significant anxiety. I give a number between 1 to 10, rating to how strongly I am paddling under the surface to indicate the level of my anxiety." Next slide, please.
So, many autistic patients also experiencing co-occurring mental health conditions often suffer from binary catastrophic thinking and behaviors. It's necessary to come up with a mental health safety plan before a crisis state is reached because of the likelihood that a crisis will occur. When I was an inpatient at a rehabilitation center, the patients had mandatory occupational therapy sessions twice weekly so that we could learn emotional regulation skills and put them into action. One tool that we were taught was the emotional activation model, which was basically a two-way thermometer with the highest and lowest parts representing hyperactivation and hypoactivation respectively, with the green center being positive median activation. I found that this scale didn't accurately represent the ease with which human brains, especially autistic brains, can jump between hyper and hypoactivation. The original model gave a false impression that in order to bounce between the two, one must progress, for example, down from red into orange, into yellow, back through green before reaching a state of hypoactivation. And it made me feel as though I was feeling my emotions incorrectly. Autistics, with their often binary and heightened sensitivities, often don't ever see themselves outside the extremes of the deep red, the dark blue, and the green. So I helped to develop this V-shaped model to better depict why, in times of crisis, our emotional states jump so easily. It seems as though they're parallel to each other rather than on opposite ends of the spectrum. A patient who describes themselves as constantly within the red or the dark blue sections is at risk for suicidality. And many autistic patients experience metabolic dysfunction that prevent many antidepressants from working properly, which further heightens the necessity for alternative forms of treatment and safety plans. Next slide.
Yeah, so we hope we've highlighted a few ways about how autism-informed mental health care can support the development of positive autistic identities. And really, we hope the takeaway from this is the need for clinicians to stay curious. Next slide. So I'm just mindful of the time, but we will quickly go through some of these resources that we highlighted. So we've already talked about the Know Your Normal toolkit, and the link is there. Next slide. This is also the Adapting Therapy Guide, which has the link there. These are all free to download. Next slide. We also wanted to highlight the Autism Mental Health Literacy Guide. So we referenced this a little earlier, and Riley was also key in developing this. But this was a collaboration between York and CAMH, the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health. And its goal is to increase awareness and share knowledge around issues related to autistic mental health. So the guide's meant to be read by everyone, but most importantly by autistic adults, family members, professionals, policymakers, and leaders. The guide highlights how individual experiences and contexts play a role in the mental health of autistic adults, and how societal acceptance and appreciation of autism is critical for better support and well-being. And we have the link for the guide, as well as some videos that are there. And you may recognize the voice on some of the videos, with Riley lending her skills to them. Next slide, please. And then this is a new resource that we co-developed at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health at CAMH. And it's Depression and Autism, a Youth-to-Youth Guide to Coping and Getting Help. And it was developed with autistic youth, caregivers, and clinicians. Next slide. So these are just some examples of the tip sheets. Again, they're free to download on the CAMH website. There's tip sheets for autistic youth from Autistic Youth. There's some tips and strategies for mental health professionals, as well as for caregivers. Next slide. And lastly, we wanted to highlight a project that Mirella and Riley and I are part of, which is the CAMH Autism and Mental Health Project. We have our website there. And we have a whole range of different events and programs for autistic youth and autistic people and their caregivers from across Canada. All of our programming and resources are free. Next slide. And these are just two of our upcoming ones. So we have an autistic-led peer support program with Riley and Mirella, both leading it, co-facilitating. And our next running of it is starting soon. And then we also have an autistic-led webinar series. So our next one is focused on autistic people in the COVID-19 pandemic. And you can find out more information about all of our events on our project website. Next slide. So that's it for us, and we're happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Ami, Mirella, and Riley for such an insightful hour. Definitely what you shared today was very, very powerful, and we can only be grateful for your incredible contribution to the autistic community. Many of our participants commented, there were a lot of comments, more than like questions, but the comments were about how our participants could relate to your stories, and they highlighted that the need for greater awareness amongst mental health professionals. And also it resonated with a lot of folks, like a lot of participants, when you talked about how much more there is to an autistic identity than a set of deficits, and that it shouldn't be a derogatory condition. So hearing your lived experiences resonated with many of our folks today. So thank you so much for that. There was another comment. It was about if only the education system, like high school and post-secondary, can understand that sometimes an autistic individual needs their parent or caregiver to help with communication as well. That was interesting too. Yeah. In terms of question, there was one question about if you can share the link to the Riley article. So I believe Ami will add the link to the article as a reference on the PowerPoint slides, and the PowerPoint will be shared with you. It will be sent out to you.
Yeah, I can add the full references for all the research that we cited.
Let me see if I have more questions. There's one question about it's so hard to get a therapist for autistic adults. A suggestion on where to find supports.
Yeah, Riley or Mirella, do you want to take a stab before I say anything?
I know for myself, the best way to find the therapist that I'm with now, it was not specifically looking for a therapist for autism, but specifically I found a trauma therapist who had experience with autism. So we could deal with the trauma from the medical system, the social system previously, but it's true, there are not a ton of resources specifically for autistic people, unfortunately.
When I moved to Toronto, I was looking for psychologists because back in Montreal, we had only one hospital doing out-clinic psychology and for adults. And the parents committee said their hospital is a children's hospital, so they shouldn't be doing any adult services. So they shut down the only free psychologist for the whole province of Quebec. So they didn't have any foresight that their children one day will be adults. And so I didn't have any more psychologists back in Quebec. So when I moved to Toronto, I had to start. I didn't have any, so I had to look for places. I know there's a lot of private places, and some are full, and there's also some more specialized. You have to find someone who knows about autism. Then, there's apparently some other groups that specialize in trans and autism, and there's all these different. I know there's waiting lists. That's a major one in Toronto, and you just have to find one that fits. It's so hard to find a psychologist you could trust, and Toronto's a big city, and yet it's like waiting lists. Imagine smaller towns, but good luck. I don't know the Toronto clinics because I haven't tried them all. So good luck.
Yeah, I think it's a real issue in terms of mental health providers being able to effectively serve autistic clients. And hopefully with more resources and more events like this, we can kind of help other people feel comfortable in providing these much needed services.
Thank you. There are other questions. One question is, you mentioned an upcoming group for individuals over 18. Is there a plan to do one for teens as well?
Yeah, it's a great question. So right now we have funding from the Public Health Agency of Canada, which is specifically, our funding is for autistic adults. And we're learning a lot about peer-led support. And it's definitely something we'd be open to exploring in the future.
And more questions coming up. Another one is about, can you create a script or document for awareness for the medical, educational, and law enforcement of why adult autistic individuals sometimes need their caregiver parent to help in communication?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't think we have a specific script for that. I think that it's important that in your own life you make your own so that it is tailored to your, patient, depending on what they're going through. But as I said earlier, it's really important to understand the language that medical, educational, law enforcement uses. So saying stuff like, this is my interpreter, this is an accommodation. A lot of those are your legal rights to have those in those situations. I find that we often say stuff like, this is my mom in my appointment, and it can come across with the wrong idea, which is a lot of the problems that we often run into. So using the language that is your right to have is really important. I don't have those specifically, but doing some of that research is really important.
There's Aspire medical toolkit that you could prepare to give your primary care doctors. The problem is, like most, especially women, we get medically gaslit by doctors. And I've started to train fourth-year University of Toronto med students, get the residents before they're out there. And I try to, because everybody's focused on the brain, and a lot of autistic women, we have other conditions, and it's not recognized by but in every support group I hear endometriosis, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and there's also POTS. So that's how I got diagnosed recently, post-orthostatic tachycardia. So well, I hope to, when I do the residence, I hope they get, I don't know what field they will get into, and I hope they get, so they won't get some information so they don't get to mistreat us. There's also eating disorders. A lot of women get diagnosed with autism after about hospitalization, eating disorders. And so there's so many fields of intersectionality. And as we saw this year, both in Quebec and in Ontario, autistic non-speaking men were tasered and taken badly, abused by policemen, and some of them knew the one in Quebec. They knew, so they have to be trained, and also if they were of a minority, they were racialized. It's also a question of intersectionality. So there's like in the U.S. there was a book about a policeman about how to deal with autistic people, and then there's also people who say, oh, we should bring a card to tell doctors, but then we realize if an autistic person puts their hand in their pocket, they could get hurt. So that is also another question. So there were solutions, and then in the real life, they didn't work out, having those, I am autistic. So that's definitely more training to be done in the wider community.
I think also we have the youth to youth depression tip sheet guide that we had shared a little bit earlier that Ami and I had worked on. And it is youth to youth autistic, but it's also for caregivers, it's for practitioners. So sharing those resources with your practitioners, with the people in your life, is one of the best ways to, spread education and information.
Great, thank you. So this past hour has been very insightful, and I appreciate everything you had to say today. So once again, today's session is recorded and it will be available by next week on our website. And like it was mentioned in the comments, we will be sharing the PowerPoint and the link through Hopin after the event. So one last thing, thank you all for joining us today. Before you go, please, in the chat, you will see a link to a survey. If you don't mind, you will also receive an email with this link. Please fill it out, and you can stand a chance to win one of the 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. A little incentive there. You will also receive an email with the link to today's recording and the PowerPoint handout. So yeah, thank you again, Ami, Riley, Mirella. It was fantastic, and everyone who attended this event. It's been great. Thank you so much.